Before she saw the blade, she smelled the smoke, burning pine, wet earth, and something bitter curling underneath it all. Something that had no name, but every wolf in that circle recognized on instinct. It was the smell of a verdict already decided. The smell of a life being measured in its final seconds. It was fear. Not the trembling kind that lives in your hands. The deep kind. The kind that settles at the base of your spine and whispers to you that no matter how still you stand, no matter how steady you keep your chin, the ground beneath you has already cracked open, and you are already falling. That kind of fear has a taste. Cold, metallic, like pressing your tongue to the flat of a sword. She knew that taste well by now. Her name was Lira, and she was standing in the middle of the execution circle with her wrists bound behind her and 1,000 wolves breathing in perfect unison around her, their exhales rising in white clouds against the frozen night air, and not one of them had spoken a single word in her defense. Not one. Because in the hierarchy of this world, an Omega did not get defense. An Omega got a verdict. And the verdict had been handed down 3 days ago, in a room she was never even allowed to enter. Guilty. Guilty of the murder of Luna Seraphine. Beloved. Chosen mate of the Alpha King. Guilty of stealing the life of the one woman every pack in the Northern Territories had called sacred. She had not done it. She needed you to know that. Not because it would save her, it wouldn't. Not tonight. Not in this circle, but because the truth of a thing matters even when no one is listening. Even when the only witness is the moon hanging cold and indifferent above the tree line. She had not touched Seraphine, had never even spoken to her, had barely existed in the same world as her. But someone had, and someone had made sure every finger of blame curved in Lira's direction. And now here she stood, an Omega with no pack, no rank, no voice, the perfect sacrifice for a king's grief. The executioner stepped forward. She did not look at him. She looked at Saurin. He stood at the edge of the circle, draped in black, utterly still, the kind of stillness that isn't peace but control. The kind a man builds like armor over years of carrying a weight no one else can see. His jaw was set. His silver eyes were locked on her with an expression she could not fully read, but felt in her chest like a hand closing around her heart. Not tenderness, not mercy, something rawer than that. Something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. This was the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf alive in 3 generations, the man who had signed her death order without blinking. And yet, she noticed it. She couldn't not notice it, because she was about to die, and her mind was cataloging everything with the desperate precision of someone who knows these are the last images she will ever hold. His hand was trembling, just slightly, just barely. A vibration in the fingers of his right hand where they hung at his side, curled halfway into a fist. No one else would have seen it. No one else was looking at him the way she was. But she saw it, and the sight of it did something unexpected to her. It cracked something open in the center of her chest, some small, irrational warmth in the middle of all that cold terror. He was not as certain as he wanted to be. The executioner raised the blade. The moonlight caught it and fractured across the steel, and she watched the light scatter like it was trying to escape. And she thought, absurdly, that she understood the feeling. The blade descended. Cold steel kissed her throat, a single, precise point of contact, just below her jaw, where her pulse was running fast and wild and completely beyond her control. She closed her eyes. She thought, strangely, of a morning years ago, when she was very small sunlight on tall grass, the smell of honeysuckle climbing a fence she used to sit on, and she held that image, cradled it, made it the last thing she intended to carry out of this world. And then, a hand shot out like a strike of lightning, not slowly, not hesitantly, with the absolute bone-deep authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to justify a decision. It caught the executioner's wrist and stopped the blade, 1 inch from her skin. The circle went utterly silent. A different silence now. Not the waiting kind, but the stunned kind. the kind that follows the impossible. 1,000 wolves held their breath. The executioner froze, eyes wide, daring nothing. And Saurin the Alpha King, the man who had condemned her, the man whose grief had become a kingdom's law, stood there with his hand locked around that wrist, and his chest rising and falling like he had just surfaced from deep water. He inhaled, long, slow, unguarded in a way that was almost painful to witness on a man built so entirely from armor, and something shifted in his face. Something ancient. Something that had nothing to do with courts or verdicts or the politics of power. Because beneath the blood that stained her clothes from 3 days of captivity, beneath the smoke in the air and the terror soaked into her skin, and the cold that had settled into her bones, she smelled like honeysuckle. And wolves, no matter how powerful, no matter how controlled, no matter how many years they have spent teaching themselves to choose reason over instinct, do not negotiate with fate. The bond does not knock. It does not ask permission. It does not care about grief or guilt, or the 1,000 people watching, or the blade that was a single breath away from ending everything. It simply arrives. And in the silence of that execution circle, with the moon watching and the blade hanging, and the whole world balanced on the edge of one man's exhale, it arrived.
I had imagined this moment differently. I think, when you spend 3 days in a stone cell waiting for your execution, your mind builds a version of it that you can survive mentally. A version where you are calm, where you are dignified, where the cold doesn't get into your teeth, and the silver rope doesn't burn your wrists down to something raw and weeping, where you stand in front of 1,000 wolves and you feel nothing, because feeling nothing is the only kind of armor an Omega ever gets to wear. But dignity, I was learning, is a luxury, and I had run out of those long before tonight. The stone circle was ancient. That was the first thing I noticed when they walked me out into it. Not the crowd, not the torches burning orange against the black sky, not even the weight of all those eyes landing on me at once. It was the ground itself. The stones were worn smooth by centuries of feet, and I understood with a horrible, quiet clarity that I was not the first person to stand here like this. That this circle had been absorbing the weight of the condemned for longer than anyone alive could remember. That the ground beneath me had heard every plea, every sob, every final exhale of someone who had run out of tomorrows. I wondered if it would remember mine. They had dressed me in white. I didn't know if that was mercy or cruelty, white for innocence, or white because it would show the blood. I had stopped trying to interpret the gestures of people who had already decided I was guilty. There was no point in reading kindness into the choreography of your own death. The silver rope around my wrists was not decorative. Anyone who tells you silver against Omega skin is merely symbolic has never worn it. It burned a slow, deep, cellular burn, the kind that doesn't scream but hums, constant and inescapable, like a frequency your body cannot tune out. My hands had gone partially numb hours ago. What remained was something worse than pain, a wrongness, a feeling of being unmade at the edges. I stood straight anyway, not for them, for myself, because I had decided somewhere in that stone cell that whatever they took from me tonight, they were not taking that. They were not getting the image of me crumbling. Let them have my life. They were not getting my spine. The crowd was enormous. Wolves from every pack in the northern territories, I was told. They had come from 3 days' travel in some cases, pulled in by the gravity of it, by the spectacle, by the particular hunger that lives in communities when someone at the bottom of the hierarchy gets accused of reaching too high. I was an Omega, unmated, unranked, unaffiliated with any pack strong enough to speak for me. In the social architecture of this world, I was the person everyone agreed could be sacrificed without consequence. The math of it was simple and brutal, and I had understood it the moment they dragged me into that courtroom and I saw the way the assembled wolves looked at me, not with hatred, exactly, but with something almost like relief. Better her than someone who matters. I knew that look. I had been receiving a version of it my entire life. And then Saurin stepped forward, and the crowd went silent, the way a crowd only goes silent for one kind of person, not out of politeness, not out of ceremony, but out of something biological, something that lives beneath language and rank and conscious thought. Every wolf in that circle felt his alpha aura like a change in atmospheric pressure, like the moment before a storm when the air itself seems to decide to get out of the way. He was not what I expected. I know how that sounds. I had heard the stories, the same as everyone. The Alpha King who had united 6 warring packs through sheer force of will and dominance that made elder wolves lower their eyes without being asked. The man who had loved Selene, beautiful, gentle Selene, whom every pack had adored with a totality that was spoken of in the same breath as the old myths. The kind of love that becomes legend while it's still living. They had been betrothed since childhood, grown together like 2 trees whose roots had long since tangled underground. And when she died, when someone poisoned her in her own chambers and left her body arranged like a message, something in Saurin had gone with her. Everyone knew it. You could see it, if you looked. And I looked. I couldn't help it. Standing in the middle of that circle with the torchlight flickering across the faces of 1,000 strangers who had come to watch me die, he was the only thing my eyes could find and hold. Maybe because he was the one who had signed the order. Maybe because some stubborn, irrational part of me was still searching for a trace of doubt in his face, some crack in the verdict, some hesitation I could anchor a sliver of hope to. But what I found was not doubt. It was grief. Raw, barely contained. The kind that has stopped sleeping and started living in a person's bones. It was in the set of his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle flickering at the corner. It was in his eyes, silver and storm dark, and the way they moved across the circle without ever fully landing on anything, like a man whose vision keeps sliding past the surface of things because the surface of things no longer resembles the world he used to know. He unrolled the parchment, and he read the charge. I don't remember every word. I remember the way his voice sounded low, controlled, carrying across the entire circle without effort, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume because authority is already built into the architecture of it. I remember the specific weight of each accusation as it landed. Trespassing in the royal wing. Presence confirmed in Selene's chambers in the hour before her death. A vial found in my possessions, a vial I had never seen before in my life, containing the exact compound that had stopped her heart. And I remember the moment he said her name. Selene. Just that. Just the name, 2 syllables, no ceremony around it, and yet the way it left his mouth was devastating. Like something he was still learning how to carry. Like a word that used to mean everything and now meant only the shape of what was missing. His voice didn't break, not fully, not visibly, but there was a fracture in it, hairline thin, the kind only someone listening very closely would catch. I was listening very closely, and standing there, bound in silver, facing my own execution, I felt something shift inside me that I was entirely unprepared for. Not sympathy, or not only sympathy, something more complicated. Something that looked directly at this man who had condemned me without hearing me, who had signed my death warrant from inside his grief, without once considering that grief is not the same as evidence, and could not make itself hate him. I tried. God, I tried. Hatred would have been cleaner. Hatred would have given me somewhere to put all of this, the injustice, the terror, the burning silver, the 1,000 eyes. Hatred would have made the dying simpler, I think. You can die angry, and it feels, at least, like agency. But looking at him, really looking, I didn't see a tyrant. I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who had loved someone with everything he had and lost her, and in the wreckage of that loss had reached for the nearest explanation and held on to it with both hands, because the alternative, that it was random, that it was cruel, that the universe had simply taken her without reason or justice, was a thing he could not survive. I understood that. I hated that I understood it. The parchment was rolled closed. The judgment was spoken. The executioner took his position behind me, and I felt the air shift as he raised the blade, and I thought very clearly, very quietly, the way your mind goes strange and focused in the last few seconds. I thought about honeysuckle, about sunlight, about a fence I used to sit on when I was small enough that the world still felt like it might have room for me in it. The blade came down. Cold steel found my throat. And then a hand. His hand. shooting out with a speed and force that made the executioner stumble back a step, locking around that wrist with a grip that left no room for question or argument or anything except absolute, irreversible stop. 1 inch. The steel had stopped 1 inch from my skin. 3 seconds passed. No one breathed. Not one wolf in that circle dared to move or speak or even shift their weight. The torches crackled. The wind moved through the tree line beyond the stones. And Saurin stood there, chest heaving, his grip on the executioner's wrist iron tight, his head turned slightly toward me, not fully, not yet, as if some last line of resistance was still holding him at an angle from the truth. And then I heard it, not with my ears, deeper than that, down in the marrow, in the place where wolves carry the things that have no words, a sound that wasn't a sound, a recognition that cracked through every wall I had ever built, every layer of survival instinct and careful blankness I had wrapped around myself to get through 3 days in that cell. It moved through him like a tremor. I watched it cross his face, watched the grief and the certainty and the controlled authority come apart at the seams. Just slightly, just enough, and what replaced it was something ancient and enormous, and entirely beyond the reach of kings or courts or verdicts. One word, not spoken, not chosen, simply known. Mate. I felt it before I understood it. That is the only honest way I know how to describe what happened in the 3 seconds after his hand stopped the blade. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision my mind made and then communicated to the rest of me. It was more primitive than that, a seismic shift somewhere beneath conscious experience, like the ground realigning under your feet after a tremor, and your body knowing, before your brain catches up, that the landscape has permanently changed. Something had happened, something I had no language for yet, and then the circle exploded. It started as sound, a wave of it, rolling inward from the outer edges of the crowd, voices colliding with each other in a wall of noise that was equal parts fury and disbelief. I heard the word Omega cut through it sharp and repeated, each utterance carrying a different flavor of outrage. I heard the word treason, someone used that word, actually used it, about the act of a king stopping his own execution order. I heard a pack elder somewhere in the crowd, his voice high and rigid with offense, shouting something about law, about precedent, about what the ancestors had established in blood and stone. And underneath all of it, I heard something else. I heard the sound of 1,000 wolves deciding, in real time, that they did not understand what they were witnessing, and that what they did not understand made them dangerous. But I could not focus on any of it, because Saurin had turned to face me fully, and our eyes met. I want to be careful here, because I know how this part of the story sounds from the outside. I know the words people use for moments like this, destined, fated, electric. I know how easily those words become small and cheap from overuse, how they flatten something enormous into something decorative, so I will not use those words. I will only tell you what I actually experienced, standing in that circle with silver burning my wrists and the crowd fracturing around us. His eyes were silver, not gray silver, the real kind, the kind that catches light the way still water does at dusk and holds it differently depending on the angle. And they were looking at me with an expression I had never seen on a person's face before. Not in 3 days of captivity. Not in a lifetime of being looked at by wolves who had already made their assessment of me before I opened my mouth. He looked horrified. Not at me. That is the distinction that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter and refused to leave. It wasn't the horror of a man confronting something monstrous. It was the horror of a man confronting something true that he is not remotely prepared for. The horror of a door swinging open onto a room you had sealed shut and told yourself you had forgotten about, and finding that everything inside it is exactly as you left it, waiting, untouched, patient in the way that only the things we refuse to feel can be patient. He looked like a man whose world had just reorganized itself around a new center of gravity, and he looked like that terrified him completely. I felt something strange bloom in the center of my chest. Not warmth, not exactly. It was too complicated for warmth. It was more like recognition, the deep animal kind, the kind that bypasses judgment and history and every reasonable thing your mind would say if you gave it a moment to weigh in. My wolf, that quiet, battered, carefully contained part of me that I had learned to keep small and still just to survive, lifted her head for the first time in years. And she knew him. Not knew as in recognized his face or his rank or the public architecture of who Saurin was. Knew him the way you know a song you've never heard before, but feel certain you have always known. Knew him in the wordless, cellular way that makes logic redundant and leaves you standing in the middle of your own chest asking questions you don't have a framework for. I looked away first. I had to, because something in his expression was pulling me toward a feeling I could not afford not here, not bound in silver, not surrounded by a crowd that had come to watch me die and was rapidly recalibrating into something potentially far more violent than a clean execution. Mercy, at least, is over quickly. A mob has no such discipline. The elder who had been shouting forced his way to the front of the circle. His name was Kalen. I knew the name from whispered conversations in the cell, the eldest of the High Council, the wolf who had sat at the right hand of 3 kings and considered himself, by virtue of that proximity, something very close to a king himself. He was old in the way that power makes some wolves old. Not fragile, not diminished, but concentrated. The soft parts burned away over decades, until what remained was essentially just will and calculation wearing a body. He stopped 6 feet from Saurin and drew himself up to his full height. My king. 2 words, but the architecture of them was not deference. It was warning, dressed in the formal clothes of respect. The sentence was lawfully passed. The circle has been called. To halt the execution is to, I am aware of what it is. Saurin's voice cut across the elders with no elevation in volume, no visible anger, and that was somehow more commanding than shouting would have been. Absolute quiet authority, the kind that doesn't argue because it doesn't recognize the premise that argument is required. Kalen's jaw tightened. The Pax will call it weakness. You have grieving families watching, a council that approved this verdict unanimously, and a crowd that traveled 3 days to witness justice carried out. She will be imprisoned. The circle went a different kind of silent now. Not the stunned silence of before, the calculating silence. The kind where 1,000 minds simultaneously begin running the implications of what they have just heard, checking it against their loyalties and interests and fears, sorting themselves in real time into categories of how dangerous this new information is to them personally. I watched it move through the crowd like weather. Kalen stared at the king for a long moment. I could see the war moving across his face, the instinct to push back against the decision warring with the much older instinct that had kept him positioned at the right hand of power for 3 generations. He was angry, genuinely, dangerously angry, but he was also, underneath that anger, calculating. He stepped back, not because he had accepted it, because he had decided this was not the battle, and that the battle would come later, in a room with no witnesses, in the language of politics and pressure that he knew far better than execution circles. 2 guards materialized at my sides. Their hands on my arms were less careful than the executioner had been rougher, confused by the abrupt reversal of what this night was supposed to be, their uncertainty cashing out as grip strength. The silver rope was not removed. If anything, the walk back through the crowd felt more dangerous than the walk out had, because an execution has a ritual containment to it, a structure that tells everyone what role they're playing. This had no structure. This was improvised, and improvisation makes wolves nervous, and nervous wolves are a specific kind of unpredictable. I kept my eyes forward, but I felt him watching me leave. I felt it the same way you feel a fire at your back, not heat exactly, but the awareness of heat, the knowledge of something burning close enough to matter. Every step I took across those worn stones, I felt his gaze tracking me with an intensity that had nothing ceremonial about it. Not the gaze of a king managing a political situation. Something rawer, something that hadn't yet figured out how to pretend to be something else. I did not look back. I told myself it was dignity, that same stubborn refusal to give them the image of me undone. But somewhere under that story I was telling myself, I knew the real reason. If I looked back and found him still watching, I didn't know what would happen to the careful architecture of numbness I had spent 3 days constructing, and I couldn't afford to find out. Not yet. Not here. The torchlight fell away as they led me into the dark of the corridor beyond the circle, and the roar of the crowd faded behind thick stone walls, and I was left alone with the burning at my wrists, and the thunder of my own heartbeat, and the memory of silver eyes that had looked at me like I was simultaneously the worst and most inevitable thing that had ever happened to them. Something had passed between us in that circle. I turned it over in the dark as they walked me back to my cell, examined it from every angle, tried to name it and failed, tried to dismiss it and failed at that too. It wasn't forgiveness. He had not forgiven me, could not, yet perhaps would not for a very long time, perhaps not until the truth of what had really happened to Celine found its way to the surface. It wasn't trust. Trust is built from something, requires materials, requires time and evidence, and the slow accumulation of proof that a person is what they claim to be. We had none of that between us. What we had was something older than both of those things, something that had not asked our permission to exist, something that was going to complicate absolutely everything. And lying on the stone floor of my cell that night, wrists still burning, the roar of the crowd still echoing faintly in the chambers of my memory, I felt it settle into me quietly, the way a stone settles to the bottom of still water. Whatever this was, it was not finished. It had, in the most terrifying sense, only just begun. The dungeon beneath the Iron Veil stronghold smelled like time. That is the truest way I can put it. Not decay, though that note was there too, underneath everything else, but mostly time. The accumulated weight of it, soaked into the stone over centuries. The particular heaviness of a place that has held too many people in too much silence for too long. Iron and damp earth, and something older beneath both. Something the stone itself had absorbed and could not release. I had been in the cell for 4 hours before I stopped counting the drips. Water somewhere in the dark, irregular, patient, indifferent to whether anyone was listening. Drip. Then silence long enough to almost forget it. Then drip again. I tried to use it to measure time. I gave up. Time in a place like that doesn't move the way time moves in the world above. It thickens. It pools. It sits against your skin like the cold does not dramatic. Not violent, just relentless in the way that only patience can be relentless. The silver rope had been replaced with iron shackles. That should have been a relief. It wasn't exactly iron against omega skin is not comfort. It's merely a lesser cruelty, but the burning had eased to something duller, something I could almost build a wall around and contain. My wrists were raw. The skin had broken in a few places where the rope had been tightest, and in the cold, the wounds had stiffened into something that pulled sharply when I moved. I moved as little as possible. I sat against the far wall with my knees drawn up, and my back against stone so cold it had long since passed through discomfort into a kind of numbness I had accepted as the floor of my current existence. I was not sleeping. I had not slept in 4 days. I was thinking about Celine. Not because I had known her, I hadn't. Not really. Not beyond the way everyone in the Northern Territories knew her. From a careful distance, through the warm mythology that had built up around her name, over years of careful public grace. She had been kind, by every account. Genuinely kind, not the performative kind that powerful people sometimes wear like jewelry. The kind that comes from actually seeing people as people rather than as furniture in the architecture of your own importance. I was thinking about her because someone had killed her, had planned it carefully, executed it deliberately, and then constructed a frame around me with the kind of precision that spoke of either extraordinary patience or extraordinary desperation. Neither of those felt like a random act. Someone had needed her gone. Someone had needed someone to blame for it. And they had looked at the available options and settled on me with the clinical efficiency of a person who understood that an unmated omega with no pack affiliation is, in the calculus of this world, the closest thing to invisible. Nobody fights for invisible people. I was still turning that over when I heard the footsteps. They were different from the guard's footsteps. I had already memorized those, the particular rhythm of the man who came to check on me every 2 hours, the slight drag of his left foot that I had catalogued without meaning to on his first pass. These footsteps were deliberate in a different register entirely. Even, controlled, heavy, with a weight that wasn't physical. I knew them before I saw him. My wolf knew them before I did. The torch at the end of the corridor flared as the door at the top of the stairs swung open, and then a single light was moving down the steps, a handheld lamp, low flame, casting a circle of amber that didn't reach far into the dark. He had come alone. No guards. No council elder trailing behind him with a parchment and an agenda. No witnesses. Just Saurin. In a dungeon, in the middle of the night, carrying a lamp that threw half his face into gold and left the rest in shadow. He stopped on the other side of the iron bars and looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us spoke for a moment that stretched itself out into something uncomfortable and necessary, at the same time the kind of silence that is not empty but full, packed with everything that hasn't been said yet, and both people knowing it. "You didn't eat," he said it without inflection, gesturing slightly toward the untouched tray near the cell door. I wasn't hungry. That wasn't optional. Neither was the execution. I heard the words leave my mouth before I had consciously decided to say them. And yet, something moved across his face, not quite flinching, nothing so unguarded as that, but an adjustment, a slight recalibration behind the eyes. He set the lamp on the ledge outside the bars and sat not on the ground, not all the way down, but with his back against the opposite wall, one knee drawn up, in the posture of a man who has decided to stay for a while and has not quite admitted that to himself yet. "Tell me what you know about the night Celine died. Not tell me where you were. Not explain the vial. Tell me what you know." It was, I realized slowly, a different question from the one the court had been asking. The court had given me a conclusion and asked me to disprove it. He was asking me to start from the beginning. I studied his face in the lamplight. His grief was still there. It wasn't going anywhere. Grief that large doesn't go anywhere quickly. It just learns to coexist with the daily requirements of being alive. But there was something else layered over it now. Something that looked, if I let myself interpret it generously, like doubt. Not certainty replaced, but certainty complicated. A small crack in the wall he had built the verdict on. I told him. Everything. From the moment I had been summoned to the royal wing, a summons that I had questioned and verified twice, because an Omega, receiving a direct summons from anyone in the royal household, was irregular enough to feel like a trap, to the route I had taken, the guards I had passed, the room I had been placed in to wait while the message I was supposedly delivering was confirmed, the room I had never left, the vial I had never seen until it was presented as evidence against me in a courtroom where my voice carried approximately the same weight as the wind against the windows. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't pace or challenge or perform skepticism. He listened the way someone listens when they are genuinely trying to build a new picture from unfamiliar pieces, rather than simply looking for confirmation of the picture they already have. His eyes stayed on my face the entire time. Not aggressive searching. The difference matters. When I finished, the silence settled back in around us. "The guard on the eastern corridor," he said finally. "Renwick. He saw me. He can confirm the time I arrived. Renwick resigned from duty 3 days ago. Left the territory." The air in the cell felt colder suddenly. "Convenient," I said quietly. "Yes." And from the flatness of that single word, I understood that this piece of information had already been troubling him, that it had been sitting in the back of his mind with the particular uncomfortable weight of things that don't fit the shape of the story they're supposed to fit. He stood, moved closer to the bars. And this is the part that I have gone over more times than I can count in the weeks since trying to reconstruct it from a distance, trying to understand how something so small could rearrange so much. He reached through the bars, not reaching for me, reaching for the tray, to pass it closer, some automatic gesture of practicality that had no sentimentality in it at all, and my hand was already there. Our fingers touched. A brush. A fraction of a second. The kind of contact that in any other context would be invisible, would pass beneath the threshold of conscious experience entirely. It didn't. Something cracked open in my chest. Not pain, I want to be precise about this, because what I felt was so far outside the register of pain that calling it pain would be a lie. It was recognition. Bone deep, cellular, older than language. Like a part of me that had been waiting in the dark for longer than I had been alive, suddenly lifted its head and exhaled for the first time. I pulled my hand back. The motion was faster and more visceral than I intended, less controlled, less dignified, coming from somewhere below the careful composure I had been maintaining since they walked me out into that execution circle. It came from the terrified part of me, the part that understood, with a clarity that bypassed every rational argument I could construct, that this, whatever this was, whatever the bond between us meant, whatever fate thought it was doing by dropping a mate connection between a condemned Omega and the king who had signed her death warrant, was the most dangerous thing in a situation that was already trying very hard to kill me. He went still. Not the controlled stillness of authority, the stillness of a man trying to manage something happening inside him that he did not choose and cannot fully contain. "I won't hurt you." Low, quiet, said with a directness that had no performance in it. I looked at him for a long moment. "You almost did." I said it simply. Not as an accusation. I didn't have the energy for accusation anymore. As a fact, as the truest, most precise sentence available to describe the reality of the last 4 days. He said nothing, but something in his face broke open briefly, just for a moment, just long enough for me to see what was behind the composure, and what I saw was not a king managing a political inconvenience. What I saw was a man standing on the edge of something enormous, looking down, trying to decide whether he was going to step back from it or fall. He picked up the lamp, turned to leave. Stopped. "There'll be a healer here in the morning," he said, and his eyes moved briefly, so deliberately, almost casually, to my wrists, to the broken skin and the discoloration from the silver rope. "For the cold, it gets worse on the lower level." He walked up the stairs without looking back. The door closed. The dark resettled itself around me. I sat very still with my back against the cold stone, and my injured wrists in my lap, and the ghost of that accidental touch still humming in the bones of my hand. And I thought about the way he had looked at my wrists, and then looked away. The way he had framed it for the cold, as if the cold were the wound, as if the silver burns and the shackle marks and all the evidence of what the last 4 days had cost me were something that had happened incidentally, by weather, by circumstance, by the ordinary cruelty of winter, rather than by a signature on a document that bore his name. The healer arrived at first light. She was efficient, quiet, and gave nothing away clearly, a woman who had learned long ago that the dungeons of the Ironvale stronghold were not a place that rewarded curiosity or commentary. She cleaned the wounds, wrapped the wrists in something that smelled of herb-steeped cloth, and took most of the bite out of the remaining burn. She left a second roll of bandage and a small clay pot of salve. She did not say who had sent her. She didn't need to. I sat with the warmth of the wrapped wrists in the cold dark long after she left, turning over the impossible, inconvenient, quietly devastating reality of what was happening, not the imprisonment, not the false accusation, not even the near execution. Him. The fact of him. The fact that the man who had almost taken my life had spent the small hours of the night sitting on the floor of a dungeon corridor, asking me questions that only made sense if he had started, quietly, to believe me. The fact that he had looked at my wounds and looked away and then sent someone to treat them before the sun came up, and had not mentioned it, had not taken credit for it, had not used it as currency in whatever negotiation he was conducting with his own conscience. The fact that his fingers had brushed mine for half a second in a cold, dark cell, and my wolf had gone quiet and certain and steady in a way she had not been in years. None of this was simple. None of this was safe. And not one single part of me, not my fear, not my logic, not the very reasonable argument I could make about the extreme inadvisability of feeling anything tender toward the man who still, technically, held my life in his hands, could make itself stop. On the second morning, they brought me the standard dungeon ration. I knew what it was before I looked at it: a hard wedge of bread and a tin cup of something that had been warm once and had long since given up on the ambition. The guard set it inside the door with the particular efficiency of a man who has performed this action enough times that it has become entirely mechanical. who has trained himself not to look at the person on the other side of the delivery, because looking makes the mechanics more complicated. I ate it because I had decided somewhere in the sleepless dark of the previous night that I was going to survive this. Not because I had a plan, I didn't. Not yet. Not because I had allies, I had none. But because the alternative was surrendering to a story that someone else had written for me, and I had been refusing to live inside other people's stories for long enough that the refusal had become something structural in me. Bone and spine, and the particular set of the jaw that my mother had once called stubbornness, and that I had long since reclassified as a survival strategy. So I ate the bread. I was still thinking about the healer's salve on my wrists, about how the burn had quieted overnight into something I could almost ignore, about the small mercy of that when the footsteps came again. Different from the guards. I had already established that much, but different from the previous nights too, in a way that took me a moment to parse. Last night he had come alone and moved quietly, with the careful step of a man conducting a private errand he has not entirely admitted to himself. This morning there were two sets of footsteps. One I recognized, one I didn't. The door opened. Saurin came through first, carrying something that it took me a disoriented moment to fully process, a covered tray, deep-sided, with a kind of weight to it that spoke of actual food rather than the procedural approximation of food that dungeons typically offered. Behind him, a step and a half back, came a man I had not seen before, tall, angular, dark-eyed, with the particular quality of stillness that distinguishes a wolf who has disciplined his instincts from one who simply has none. He was watching me with the focused, unreadable attention of someone conducting an assessment they haven't yet decided to share. I learned later his name was Augustine, the king's closest advisor and, depending on who you asked, either his most trusted counsel or the most elegant political mechanism in the northern territories, a man whose loyalty to Saurin was absolute, and whose instinct for threat was, by reputation, essentially flawless. He didn't look at me like a threat. He looked at me like a variable he hadn't fully accounted for, and was now quietly furious about. Saurin set the tray down inside the cell door without ceremony. He didn't announce it, didn't explain it, didn't construct a justification around the gesture that would make it easier for both of us to pretend it was administrative rather than personal. He just set it down, straightened, and looked at me. I looked at the tray. Real bread, soft, the kind that still had heat in it, that had been baked this morning somewhere in the stronghold's kitchens rather than days ago in a batch intended for prisoners. Roasted meat. Something with herbs in it that I could smell from where I sat and that did something involuntary to the hunger I had been quarantining in the back of my body for 4 days. A small pot of something dark and sweet preserved fruit, I thought, the kind that appears on tables at midwinter when fresh food is a memory rather than a reality. This was not dungeon food. This was food from a table that mattered. I looked up at him. "Eat," he said. Not unkindly, but with that characteristic economy, the word carrying the full weight of the intention behind it without any decorative language around it. I crossed the cell and sat near the tray and began to eat. And I want to be honest about how that felt, because the honest version is not particularly dignified, and dignity has gotten complicated enough in the last several days that I have started to let it go in increments wherever it is not strictly necessary. The honest version is that the first bite of that bread nearly undid me. Not because I was dramatically starving, I wasn't. Not yet. But because there is a specific emotional response that the body has to being cared for when it has been braced for a very long time, against the certainty that no one is coming, and that response does not ask your permission before it moves through you. I kept my face even. I ate steadily. I did not look at him more than once. But he watched me. Not with the detached monitoring of a man checking a box on a list of obligations. With attention. With something in the quality of his gaze that was hard to name, and harder to be on the receiving end of, focused and quiet, and invested in a way that he clearly hadn't planned for, and wasn't entirely comfortable with. No one had ever watched me eat before. Not like that. Not with that particular quality of attention that says, without words, that it matters to them whether the person in front of them is nourished, whether they have enough, whether they are, At the most fundamental level, okay. I had grown up in the margins of pack society where omegas were fed last and noticed least, where the question of whether I had enough was not a question anyone was tracking. I had long since stopped expecting it to be. The sensation of being tracked now by him, of all people, was strange enough to sit at the intersection of comfort and danger. Augustine moved slightly behind him. Not a step forward more, a shift of weight, a subtle repositioning that drew my attention without demanding it. He was watching the king watch me, and the expression on his face was not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who is watching a situation develop in a direction he did not recommend and has not abandoned his reservations about. "My lord." Augustine's voice was quiet, calibrated for the room, not for the corridor. Diplomatic in the way that makes a single address carry the weight of an entire argument. Saurin didn't turn. "Not now, Augustine." A pause. "The council meets in an hour. I'm aware." Another pause, longer this time, the kind that communicates everything the speaker has chosen not to say directly. Then Augustine's footsteps moved to the base of the stairs, and he stopped there, not leaving, not approaching, stationing himself at the precise distance that says, "I am giving you the space you are clearly going to take, whether I approve or not, but I am not pretending to be absent." I filed that away. Saurin crouched down on the other side of the bars, not sitting all the way, not committing fully to a posture of settling in, but down to my level, forearms resting loosely on his knees, close enough that I could see the detail of his face in the dungeon's low light. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't come from last night. Those shadows were older, the particular bruising that accumulates when sleep has been disrupted for weeks rather than days, when the body has stopped trusting the dark enough to fully let go into it. He had not been sleeping since Celine died. I knew it the way I was beginning to know things about him, that I had no conventional means of knowing, not from information, not from observation, but from whatever this bond was doing quietly between us, these small transmissions of truth that moved through it without announcement. "Tell me about the attack," he said. I looked at him. "Which one?" Something shifted in his expression. There was more than one. The vial wasn't the first move against me. I set down the bread and gave him my full attention, because this mattered, and I needed him to receive it with the same gravity I was delivering it with. 3 weeks before Celine died, someone broke into the room I was renting in the lower quarter, searched it thoroughly, took nothing, which told me they weren't looking for something to steal. They were looking for something to place. I watched his face as I said it. I reported it to the district guard. The report was filed and nothing was done. A week later, I started being followed. Saurin was very still. I noticed it first near the Eastern Market, the same face twice, in places it had no reason to be twice. I changed my routes. They changed with me. Someone had invested time in me specifically and deliberately before anyone had a reason to, before Celine died. I held his gaze steadily. Whoever did this had been building the frame for weeks. They needed someone. They selected me, and then they created the evidence around me. The vial wasn't evidence of my guilt. It was the final piece of a structure that was already built. The silence that followed was not the defensive silence of a man whose verdict is being challenged. It was the silence of a man rearranging furniture in his mind, moving pieces that have been fixed into new configurations, testing the weight of a new architecture against the old one, and feeling, somewhere in his chest where certainty lives, the difference between them. His wolf was reacting to her scent. I felt it even through the bars, that subtle thickening of the air between us that had no physical explanation but was entirely real, the bond asserting itself in the patient, unstoppable way it had been asserting itself since the execution circle. I watched him breathe slightly differently, and recognized it not as discomfort but as the specific labor of a man containing something large. "The guard who went missing," I said. "Renwick. He's not the only one, is he?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No." Then someone inside the stronghold helped build this. Someone with access and rank and a reason to want both Celine dead and a clean explanation ready before anyone started asking the right questions. The word "someone" hung between us. We both knew it narrowed the field considerably, and I watched him absorb that, watched the grief and the fury, and the slow, terrible dawning of the question he had been refusing to fully form move across his face in sequence, each one making way for the next. Because the cruelest part of being lied to by someone close to you is not the lie itself. It's the moment you understand the lie, and every decision you made in response to it, and the full cost of both, all at once. He stood up, not abruptly, deliberately, with the controlled motion of a man managing his own response carefully, because the alternative is a display in front of a prisoner and a suspicious advisor and the accumulated weight of his own failing certainty. His eyes moved to my wrists, the bandages from the healer, the careful wrapping. He looked at them for 1 second, 2, and I watched something move through his expression that he did not entirely succeed in containing. A flash of something that looked, if I let myself name it, like guilt, the specific, personal kind. Not political, not strategic, just guilt. He turned toward the stairs. "Finish eating," he said, without turning back. The words were even, practical, stripped of the vulnerability that had occupied his face a moment before. "I'll send more this evening." I watched him go. Watched the lamp ascend the stairs and the darkness settle back into the corridor. Augustine followed him up without a word, though not without one final glance at me over his shoulder long, and measuring and full of a calculation I couldn't entirely read. Not hostility, something more complicated. The look of a man who has spent years protecting someone from threats, and is now confronting the possibility that the most significant thing currently happening to the person he protects is not a threat at all, and perhaps that is more difficult to manage. I sat in the quiet with the warmth of real food in my stomach, and the herb-wrapped wounds on my wrists, and the echo of his voice saying "finish eating" as if it were an ordinary directive, as if it were not the most careful, most deliberate, most entirely unacknowledged act of protection that anyone had offered me in longer than I could remember. As if he hadn't noticed himself doing it, as if the noticing was beside the point. I picked up the bread again, and for the first time in 4 days, I did not eat because I had decided to survive. I ate because, for one quiet moment in the cold dark, surviving felt like it might be worth something. I didn't know he was investigating. That is the part that stays with me. The fact that while I was sitting in that dungeon cell cataloging the sounds of dripping water and memorizing the pattern of torch shadows on stone, he was moving, quietly, without announcing it, without convening a council or issuing a formal inquiry or doing any of the things that power usually does when it decides to examine itself, which is to say the things that give everyone implicated sufficient warning to adjust their story. He moved like a wolf who has decided to hunt rather than preside. And I didn't know any of it until he came back. 3 nights after the food, 3 days of the healer arriving at dawn, of Augustine appearing at the cell bars twice daily with the expression of a man maintaining a professional relationship with a situation he has not endorsed, of meals that were real meals and the strange, disorienting process of my body slowly remembering what it felt like to be tended to instead of managed. 3 days of turning the investigation over in my own mind, the weeks of surveillance before Celine's death, the missing guard, the vial that had been placed with surgical precision among my possessions, building a picture with missing pieces and staring at the gaps and trying to understand what shape of person creates a frame that meticulous, what they stood to gain, what they were afraid of. I had started to form a theory. I had not yet understood that the theory was about me. He came at the same hour as the first night that deep, still point past midnight, when the dungeon goes its quietest, and the guards make their rounds with the heavy-footed carelessness of men who have long since stopped expecting anything in this corridor to surprise them. The lamp came down the stairs, the familiar weight of his footsteps, the particular quality of presence that preceded him into a room before he physically arrived in it, that alpha density that the air rearranges itself around without being asked. He did not crouch this time. He stood, and the expression on his face was one I had not seen there before. Not grief, not controlled authority, not the complex thing that moved behind his eyes when the bond asserted itself between us and he was engaged in the private labor of not visibly reacting. This was something else, something that sat on the exact border between controlled and stunned, like a man who has pulled a thread expecting it to come loose and instead found the entire structure of a wall beginning to shift. He looked at me like he was seeing something he had not seen before, like I was different, and he was still working out how. "I went to the cottage," he said. "I waited. The one recorded in the archive as your last assigned residence before you were placed in the lower quarter. The assignment made 4 years ago by the regional Omega Registry. I went there with 2 of my own men. No counsel, no advisory, no one else." He paused. There was a scent in the walls. I was very still. A scent, hidden, old years old but preserved by the structure itself, the way stone holds things if they've been there long enough. A bloodline scent. His silver eyes were steady on mine. Not Omega, not unmated. Something considerably older than either of those classifications. The dungeon felt colder suddenly, though I couldn't have said whether the temperature had actually changed or whether it was the air moving through me rather than around me. "There was a child," he continued, "a girl, 7 years old, living in the adjacent structure with her grandmother. She remembered a woman from the cottage, not you, older, years before you arrived. She described her to my man in the particular detail that children retain when something made an impression on them. A woman with my coloring, she said, with eyes the color of winter sky, who smelled like something the child had no word for except that it made her feel safe the way her grandmother's hands did." He stopped. "I checked the archive," he said. "Not the regional registry, the deep archive, the one that houses bloodline records going back 8 generations. My pulse was doing something I could not regulate. Annabella. He said my name, and something in the way he said it was different from every previous time. Different in the specific way a word changes, when the person saying it has acquired new information about its full weight. What do you know about your mother? And here is the thing about that question, the reason it landed where it did. In the place below argument and above instinct where the truth about yourself lives before you have words for it. I had spent my entire life knowing very little about my mother. The story I had been given was brief and practical and designed, I understood now, to produce specific conclusions. She was an unmated Omega who died shortly after I was born, unremarkable, unaffiliated. The kind of origin story that arrives pre-labeled with the social meaning of the person it belongs to, that says this is why she is what she is, and closes the question before it can open. I had accepted it. I had not had the resources to do otherwise. "Nothing," I said honestly. "I was told she died. I was told she had no pack. I was told she had no rank. A beat. I was told she had nothing worth knowing about." Something moved through his expression at that. "Her name," he said quietly, "was Mireille Ashvan." The name meant nothing to me. It clearly meant something to him. "The Ashvane line," he said, "with the care of a man delivering information he knows will rearrange the architecture of the person receiving it, is not a minor bloodline. It is not a secondary line, not a lateral branch of something larger. It is one of the 4 founding bloodlines of the Northern Territories, the bloodlines from which all legitimate alpha succession in this region derives." He held my gaze. Mireille Ashvane was the last recorded heir of that line. She disappeared 26 years ago. The official record states she died without offspring. 26 years ago. 26 years ago was when I was born. The walls of the cell seemed to do something impossible for a moment. They stayed exactly where they were, and yet the room felt entirely different, like the same physical space had been subtly but irrevocably altered by a change in what I now understood it to contain. "Someone buried the record," he continued, "deliberately, methodically. The original entry in the bloodline registry was altered, not destroyed, because destroying it would have created an absence that a careful examiner might notice, but changed. Her offspring recorded as stillborn, her line recorded as extinct, and an infant reassigned through the Omega registry system under a new name, classified at the lowest social rank, and moved as far from the royal territories as the system allowed. The muscle in his jaw, the careful, controlled delivery of a man managing fury. Someone spent considerable effort making certain you would never know what you were. I heard my own breathing. "What am I?" I asked. And I meant it as something beyond the literal answer, though I needed that too. I meant it in the way a person asks it when they are 26 years old and sitting in a dungeon and discovering that the story they were handed about themselves at birth was not a history but a cage. He moved. It took me a moment to understand what was happening, to process the image correctly, to align what my eyes were reporting with what my understanding of the world could accommodate. Because Saurin, the Alpha King, the man who commanded absolute deference from every wolf in 3 territories, who had been raised from birth to occupy the highest position of power available in this world, knelt, a single knee to the stone floor of the dungeon corridor, outside the bars of my cell, in the lamplight. Not a diplomatic gesture, not a performance for an audience that wasn't present. Something genuine and private and clearly costing him something to give, the way the true versions of things always cost more than the ceremonial ones. He looked up at me from that position, and his eyes were steady and certain, in a way that no other part of the last several days had been. "Your bloodline," he said, "outranks mine." I stared at him. The laugh that came out of me was not the response either of us expected. It arrived involuntarily, with the slightly unhinged quality of an emotion that has been under pressure too long, and has found an exit point that is adjacent to, but not quite within the range of what the moment called for. Not humor exactly, something closer to the body's refusal to process the impossible all at once. "I was raised as an omega," I said. The words came out with the particular flatness of a statement that is both completely true and apparently completely insufficient to describe the situation. I was assigned tasks. I cleaned floors. I was ranked below every wolf in every room I ever walked into. I was invisible by design. I stopped, pressed my hand flat against the cold stone floor to anchor myself. "I don't know how to be what you're describing." He remained kneeling. He had not moved, had not reached for the gesture back and turned it into something more comfortable. "That," he said quietly, "is what they were counting on." The silence that followed was very different from any previous silence between us. Not the silence of 2 people navigating the charged territory of something forbidden, not the silence of grief or suspicion or the careful management of a bond that had arrived without being invited. This was the silence of something settling, something clicking into position with the specific, irreversible solidity of a truth, finally occupying the space it was always meant to occupy. Someone had killed Celine. Someone had framed me. Someone who had known, long before I did, that I was not what my registry said I was, and had understood that a woman who knew her own bloodline and her own rank would not be a usable sacrifice, would not be invisible, would not be the person the crowd looked at and thought better her than someone who matters. They had needed me small. They had spent 26 years making sure I was. "Augustine." I said his name carefully. "Does he know?" Saurin rose from the floor in a single controlled motion. "Not yet." "Do you trust him?" A pause that told me everything, not because it was long, but because it existed at all. A man with absolute confidence in his closest advisor does not pause at that question. "With my life," he said finally, "but I don't yet know what else was built into his knowledge without his understanding it. Someone close to this court constructed this. I'm not prepared to assume the construction stopped at the archive." He looked at me through the bars, and I looked back at him, this man who had almost killed me, who had brought me food in the dark and sent a healer before sunrise and refused to announce either gesture, who had gone quietly into the cold 3 days ago and pulled a thread that had unraveled a 26-year lie, who was now standing in a dungeon corridor with stone dust on his knee from kneeling before an omega who was apparently not an omega at all. "Then they buried a queen," he said. "Not with ceremony, not with the rhetorical weight of a man constructing a moment. Quietly, almost to himself, the way you say a thing when you are still integrating it, when the truth of it is still making its way from the mind into the body, into the place where you carry the things that have changed you." I felt the words go through me like a current, and something inside me, some room that had been kept shuttered and dark for so long I had forgotten it was there, opened. Not wide, not all at once, just a crack, just enough to let in the specific quality of light that only comes when a person encounters the truth of themselves for the first time and discovers it is not the small, diminished thing they were handed. Just enough to let in air. I did not know yet what I was going to do with this. I did not know yet who had buried me, or why, or what the full architecture of it would reveal when Saurin continued pulling threads. I did not know yet what we were to each other, what the bond meant in a world that was already tilting on its axis, whether it was a complication or a compass, whether it would survive the weight of everything that still stood between us. But I knew this. I was not what they had made me. I had never been. And somewhere in the space between that knowledge and what came next, everything was about to change. They came for him at dawn. Not with weapons. Men like Kalen do not come with weapons when they have bureaucracy available to them. And the High Council of the Northern Territories had 600 years of bureaucracy at its disposal, layered and cross-referenced and sharpened by generations of political architects who understood that paper, properly wielded, cuts deeper than steel and leaves wounds that are significantly harder to close. I heard it from the cell. Not the words, the walls were too thick for that, but the register of it. The particular acoustic signature of a confrontation happening in a chamber directly above the dungeon, the sound conducting itself down through the stone in pulses that told me, without any specific content, that something was breaking open. The healer had come and gone that morning. Augustine had made his twice-daily appearance at the bars with his careful, measuring gaze and left without comment, which had started to feel like its own form of communication, the things he chose not to say accumulating into a position I couldn't yet fully read. The food had come. The day had moved through its gray, lightless progression the way dungeon days do. And then the sound from above changed. It went from confrontation to something else. Something with edges. I was on my feet before I consciously decided to stand. The door at the top of the stairs opened 40 minutes later. Saurin came down alone, and I knew immediately that something had shifted, not in his composure, which was as controlled as it always was, but in the quality beneath it. Something had been decided. Something that wasn't reversible. I had learned, in the days we had been doing this strange, circling, bars-between-us negotiation of trust and truth, to read him in the register below language. The wolf in me had been doing it without my permission since the execution circle, picking up transmissions I didn't ask for and couldn't turn off. He was resolved. Whatever had happened in that chamber above us, he had come out of it decided rather than pressed, which was a distinction that mattered enormously. He stopped outside the bars, looked at me directly, without preamble, without the small conversational bridge he sometimes constructed between arriving and saying the actual thing. "The council presented a formal censure this morning," he said. "Continued detention of the accused without proceeding to execution is a violation of the Iron Veil Compact, which requires either sentencing or release within 7 days. Today is day 6. I kept my face even. "And their recommendation? Execution. Dawn tomorrow. They brought a secondary motion calling into question my fitness to rule on the grounds of demonstrated hesitation in the application of justice." A pause, and in that pause the full weight of what he was carrying, the grief, the investigation, the bond, the political machinery turning against him from the inside. "Kalen has been collecting signatures." I absorbed that. "What did you say to them?" His jaw moved slightly. "I told them I required 1 hour to consider the motion. Then I came here. 1 hour. The math of it was not lost on me, not the timeline, not the fact that he had come directly here rather than to Augustine, or to his own chambers, or to any of the other places a king goes when he is managing a political crisis. He had come to the dungeon, to me, with 1 hour and a decision he had apparently already made, because the quality of someone who has come to deliberate is entirely different from the quality of someone who has come to act. He reached into his coat. What he placed on the ledge outside the bars was a document. Dense script, heavy seal, the kind of thing that takes a palace archivist the better part of a morning to prepare. I didn't need to be able to read every word to understand the broad shape of it. I had spent enough time in the lower quarter, in proximity to the administrative mechanics of pack law, to recognize a bloodline declaration, an official one, with his seal. "If I present this to the council," he said, "it supersedes the compact motion. A confirmed bloodline heir of founding rank cannot be executed under common law. The treaty provisions are explicit. It removes their legal mechanism." He looked at me steadily. "But it does not remove their political one. Presenting this without the bond confirmation gives them room to challenge the document as fabricated. As a king creating cover for a personal decision, the muscle in his jaw, they will dismantle you through other channels if they have sufficient doubt about my motivation." I understood where this was going, and the understanding moved through me with a sensation I could not have named. Precisely not fear, though fear was present. Not hope, though that was present too, improbably, stubbornly, in defiance of everything reasonable. Something that existed in the space where both of those things meet and become something third. "The bond confirmation," I said. "The mate mark. It is not a small thing," he said immediately, and the speed of the clarification told me he had anticipated my potential misreading of the offer, that he was aware of how this could land, of the power differential between us, of the fact that I was standing in a cell and he was standing outside it, and nothing about the architecture of this situation lent itself to genuine free choice. "I am not asking you to—" "I know what you're not asking," I said. Silence. "I'm asking what you are asking," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "I am asking," he said carefully, "whether you are willing, not as strategy, not as legal mechanism. I am asking whether what you feel what I know you feel, because I feel it too and I have stopped pretending otherwise, is something you are willing to claim. In front of the council, in front of everyone. A breath. I am asking if you will stand next to me while I tell them what you are, and let me tell them what you are to me." The dungeon was very quiet. The drip of water somewhere in the dark, the distant sound of torches, my own heartbeat, which had stopped cooperating with the pretense of steadiness somewhere in the middle of that speech. I thought about 26 years of being made small, 26 years of the floor, of last in every room, of the careful, comprehensive work someone had done to ensure I never knew my own name well enough to say it at full volume. I thought about Celine Gentle, beloved Celine, who had died because someone needed a clean explanation, and who had not deserved to be used that way, and whose truth deserved to come to the surface alongside mine. I thought about the way he had knelt on the dungeon floor, not for a queen, before the truth of one. "Open the cell," I said. He held my gaze for one more second. Then he reached for the key. The lock opened with a sound that was entirely ordinary mechanical. Iron, the mundane physics of a bolt disengaging, and yet I felt it in my chest as something considerably larger. The door swung inward. I stepped through it for the first time in 6 days, and the corridor outside the cell was identical to the corridor visible through the bars, same stone and same dark and same cold, and yet standing in it felt different in a way I didn't have precise language for. He was close, closer than the bars had ever allowed, and the bond responded to that immediacy, with a low, resonant intensity that moved through every layer of me simultaneously. The wolf and the woman, and the part that was neither but contained both. His scent was different at this proximity. Underneath the authority and the pine cold of the outside air that still clung to his coat, there was something warm and deep, something that my wolf received not as information but as homecoming. He raised his hand, and when his hand touched my throat, not with force, not with possession, but with the specific, irreversible tenderness of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not plan to go, and has chosen to stay, I felt the world narrow to one heartbeat. Just one, mine and his, synchronized with the particular precision of two things that have been calibrated to each other across a distance they were never supposed to maintain. The mate mark is not, as stories sometimes render it, a violent claiming. It is not pain, or not only pain. It is the specific sensation of a wall you have been leaning against your entire life, suddenly stepping back, and your body, which had organized itself entirely around the resistance, having to learn in one overwhelming moment how to stand without it. It moves through you like electricity and like grief and like relief, all at once, in proportions you could not have predicted. His forehead dropped to mine. His breath came out slow and uneven, and entirely unguarded the sound of a man who has been holding something enormous for a very long time, and has finally, in this corridor, in the dark, set it down. One word, not spoken aloud, not needed aloud, because it was already moving through the bond with the clarity of something that has always been true and is only now being acknowledged. Mate. Not a question this time. Not a disruption. Not the impossible, unwanted intervention that had stopped a blade in an execution circle 6 days ago. Something settled. Something confirmed. The difference between a tremor and the ground. I stood in the corridor outside my cell, with the mate mark warm against my throat and his forehead against mine, and the document on the ledge with his seal. And 1 hour, less than 1 hour now before the council expected his price. Answer. They're going to fight this, I said quietly. Yes. Kalen won't accept a bloodline document and a mate bond as sufficient. He'll look for another angle. He will. Then we need to find who killed Celine before they find a way to use her death against us again. He lifted his head, looked at me, and for the first time since the execution circle, what I saw in his face was not grief holding everything else hostage. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time, and I had made my peace with that, because Celine had deserved to be loved the way he had loved her, and the loss of that love was real and not something to be managed away. But alongside it, fully formed and fully present, was something else. Purpose. Shared. Between us. Pointing in the same direction. Then we start now, he said. He picked up the document from the ledge, offered me his hand not as a gesture of guidance or possession, not as a king managing an asset, but with the simple, radical openness of a person who has decided to stop pretending they are not asking for something. I looked at his hand. I thought about floors and invisible people, and the 26-year gap in a bloodline record that someone had filled with a lie. I thought about how different this corridor looked from the inside of the cell, and I took his hand. We walked up the stairs together, toward the council chamber, toward Kalen and his signatures and the full weight of a political machinery that had not yet understood what was coming toward it, toward the truth, toward everything that had been buried, toward whatever came next, not as a queen without a kingdom or a king without his certainty, not as a woman who had spent her life as a footnote in other people's stories, as something the Northern Territories had not seen in a very long time, as mates, as a force, quiet and decided and entirely finished with being managed. And the stone stairs did not care what we were becoming, but the world above them was about to find out. The council chamber was exactly what I expected. Cold, stone. The particular theatrical severity of a room designed to remind everyone in it of the weight of institutional authority, the long table, the high-backed seats arranged in a hierarchy that communicated rank before a single word was spoken. The banners of the six-packs hung in deliberate order along the walls. Kalen at the center, flanked by 4 other elders whose faces I had not seen before but whose expressions were variations on a single theme. The specific disapproval of men who have invested considerable political capital in a conclusion, and have arrived to find the conclusion under dispute. Saurin walked in ahead of me. I walked in beside him. Not behind. Beside. And I watched the room register that watched it move across the faces of the assembled elders like weather crossing open ground, each face recalibrating in sequence from expectation to confusion to something considerably harder. Kalen's eyes went from Saurin to me, to the mate mark at my throat, and the expression that settled over his features was not the anger I had expected. It was colder than anger. More deliberate. He had prepared for something. He had not prepared for this. Saurin placed the bloodline document on the table. He did not explain it, did not construct the political case around it, or deliver the contextual architecture of the investigation, or take the council through the archive records and the missing guard and the scent preserved in cottage walls. He simply placed it on the table with the flat certainty of a man who has already decided that the conversation taking place in this room is not the one that actually matters. The compact motion is dissolved, he said, on grounds of founding bloodline precedents, which supersedes compact jurisdiction under the original treaty provisions this council ratified, and which are not subject to selective application. A pause. If any member of this council disputes the document's authenticity, they may present their objection through the archive review process. That process takes 40 days. He looked at Kaelin directly. I trust that is sufficient time for everyone to adjust their position. Kaelin looked at the document, looked at me, looked at the mate mark, and I watched him do the calculation, the full, rapid political calculation of a man who has spent 60 years surviving in proximity to power and understands, before anyone else in the room has finished processing the situation, that the ground has shifted in a way that his current strategy cannot accommodate. He was not finished. I understood that clearly. A man like Kaelin is never finished. But he was rescheduling, and the rescheduling looked, from the outside, identical to yielding. He inclined his head. The session lasted 11 minutes. We did not speak on the way to the private wing. Not because there was nothing to say. There was everything to say, entire landscapes of it, accumulated across 6 days of bars and lamplight and careful, circling truth-telling. But the silence between us had changed. It was no longer the silence of two people managing a distance. It was the silence of two people who have arrived somewhere together and are still absorbing the reality of having arrived. His chambers were not what I expected, which I recognized said something about the assumptions I had been carrying. I had constructed, somewhere in the dungeon, an image of the Alpha King's private space that matched the public architecture of his authority stone and severity, and the deliberate minimalism of a man who has nothing left to prove. What I found was quieter than that. Books. Actual books, not displayed but read, their spines broken, and their pages marked in the margins with handwriting, too small for me to read from where I stood, but present evidence of a private intellectual life that the execution circle and the council chamber and the whole public performance of kingship had given no indication of. A low fire, a window that looked out over the tree line, the same tree line visible from the execution circle, the same trees that had been black against the night sky when the blade descended. They looked different from this side. He closed the door, and then we stood in the quiet of a private room for the first time, with no bars between us and no audience and no crisis requiring the immediate management of whatever was happening between us. And the absence of all that scaffolding left the thing between us standing in the open with nothing to lean on and nowhere to be anything other than exactly what it was. He looked at me. I looked at him. I tried to hate you, he said. He said it simply. Not as confession, not as apology as fact, offered with the directness of a man who has stopped having the energy to be anything other than honest. From the moment the bond announced itself in the execution circle, I tried to contain it as a biological anomaly, a stress response, some malfunction of the mate recognition system under extreme conditions. The firelight moved across his face. I told myself it was grief distorting my instincts, that I was looking for something to hold on to and had projected it onto the nearest available person. He stopped. None of it worked. Something in my chest loosened, not dramatically, not with the sudden relief of a catastrophe averted, but with the slow, almost structural quality of tension that has been maintained for so long, it had started to feel like your own skeleton, releasing all at once and leaving you standing in the unfamiliar lightness of your own body without its armor. I tried to fear you, I said. He was very still. Fear was logical, I said. You had signed my death warrant. You held every mechanism of my fate in your hands. Fear was the appropriate response, the measured response, the response that would have kept me behind a wall that nothing and no one could use against me. I looked at him directly, the way I had learned to look at him, without flinching from what looking cost. But every time you came down those stairs, the fear just rearranged itself into something I didn't have a name for, something that was not afraid of you at all, and was very afraid of itself. The fire crackled. He crossed the room. Not quickly. With the careful, deliberate pace of a man who is done rushing past the truth of a moment, who has spent enough time managing distance to recognize what the management costs. He stopped in front of me closer than the bars had ever allowed except for that single brush of fingers on the cell floor. And at this proximity, the bond between us was not a current or a tremor, or any of the inadequate metaphors I had been reaching for. It was simply presence. the specific, irreducible presence of a person your wolf has already decided is home. He reached for my hands, took them gently, turned them so the wrists faced upward, the bandaged ones, the healer's careful wrapping now several days old. The burns beneath it healed to the thin, shiny stage that I knew would scar. He looked at them for a long moment, and what moved through his face was not guilt this time, though guilt was somewhere underneath it. It was something more particular, more personal. He touched the silver burns on my wrists like they were something sacred. Not with pity, I want to be precise about this distinction, because pity and tenderness are entirely different things, and I had spent a lifetime receiving the former, and no time whatsoever receiving the latter, and the difference between them is not subtle. His touch was careful the way you are careful with something that matters. The way you are careful when you understand that the damage you are looking at is not abstract, that it has a history and a cost, and that the person wearing it carried it alone, without anyone to acknowledge the weight of it, for every day between the moment it was inflicted and this one. His thumb moved slowly across the edge of one scar. "I did this," he said quietly. "You stopped it first," I said. He looked up at me. 1 inch, I said. "You stopped it 1 inch from my throat." I know the difference between the man who signed a verdict from inside his grief and the man who stopped the blade before it completed the sentence. They are not the same man. I stopped trying to make them the same man somewhere around the 3rd night in the cell. A breath. "I need you to stop trying to make them the same man too." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not with the visible fracture of a man coming apart. With the quiet, involuntary quality of something that has been held very tightly for a very long time, releasing in a single, controlled. Exhale the grief and the guilt, and the weeks of sleeplessness and the particular devastation of loving someone and losing them, and then discovering that in the wreckage of that loss you had come within 1 inch of left to skill, destroying something entirely different, something your wolf had recognized and your grief had refused to see. He pressed his lips to one wrist, the softest possible contact. Barely a touch, more intention than pressure. The kind of gesture that isn't about claiming but about witnessing, about saying, without words, "I see what this cost you and I am not going to look away from it." My breath came out uneven. "Celine," he said against my wrist. "She would have—" He stopped, gathered himself. "She was kind in a specific way. The way that some people are kind as a philosophy, not a performance. She would have been furious at me, something close to painful softness in his voice. She would have told me I was an idiot. She sounds like she was remarkable," I said gently. "She was." He lifted his head. "And she is not here. And the grief of that is real, and I am not going to pretend it has resolved itself in 6 days of dungeon conversations and a mate bond that arrived without being asked." His eyes held mine steadily. "But she is not here, and you are. And those are 2 true things that I am finished trying to make cancel each other out." He raised one hand and touched my face, the side of my jaw, the edge of it, with the kind of careful intentionality that says this is chosen, every millimeter of it, nothing accidental, nothing performed. My wolf went entirely quiet, not the alert stillness of an animal tracking something uncertain, the deep settled quiet of an animal that has finally, after a very long time of moving through the world at a cautious half-trot, stopped, put down the vigilance, decided, against every previous piece of evidence the world had provided, that this particular place was safe enough to rest in. "I don't know how to do this," I said honestly. "I don't have a framework for it. I was raised at the bottom of everything. I don't know how to stand next to you in that council chamber and be what the bloodline document says I am. I don't know how to be a queen. The admission cost something, but it was better out than in, and I was finished paying the cost of holding things inside where they calcified. I only know how to survive." He looked at me for a long moment. "You survived 6 days in a dungeon after an almost execution," he said. "You catalogued the evidence of a conspiracy while sitting in silver-burned chains. You walked into a council chamber this morning next to a king, and you did not flinch once." His thumb traced the edge of my jaw. "You have been a queen your entire life. You simply haven't had the room." The fire had burned lower. The window showed the tree line dark against a sky that was beginning its slow, reluctant drift toward the first gray of early morning. The world outside was the same world it had been the night of the execution. Same trees, same cold, same moon somewhere behind the cloud cover. And yet everything within the perimeter of this room, this quiet, this fire, felt like a different country entirely. He drew me close. Not with urgency, with the slow, deliberate tenderness of a man who has decided that he is done rushing past the moments that matter, who understands that the moments that matter are not infinite, and that their value is in the being present inside them, not in the arriving at what comes after. His arms around me were solid and certain in the specific way that only belonging can be, and I stood inside that certainty and let myself, for the first time in 6 days, in years, perhaps in the entire remembered history of my life, let myself stop holding everything up alone. My head against his chest, his heartbeat, steady, the bond between us not a disruption anymore, but a current warm, even, running quietly through the shared space of two people who had failed, completely and without any possibility of recovery, at both hating and fearing each other. Outside, the investigation was ongoing. Kaylin was rescheduling. Someone in the stronghold had killed Celine and framed me and buried a bloodline, and the full shape of that conspiracy had not yet revealed itself. The work was not done. The danger was not gone. The Northern Territories were about to encounter a version of their Alpha King that came with a complication they had not anticipated, and the political fallout of that was a problem that would begin generating consequences the moment the sun came up. All of that was true, and it was also true that right now, in this room, in the low firelight, something that had been broken open and something that had been buried were both, quietly, in the same breath, beginning to heal. The warning came 3 days later, at the wrong hour, not dawn. Not the calculated timing of a political move, which tends toward morning when minds are sharpest and the architecture of power is most alert to formal challenge. This came at the hour before midnight, when the blood moon had climbed to its apex, and the sky above Ironvale was the particular deep red that happens once every generation, that ancient, arterial color that makes wolves restless in a way that has nothing to do with choice, and everything to do with what lives below conscious thought in the oldest chambers of the species. It started with the guards. I heard it before I saw it, a sound moving through the stronghold from the outer walls inward, following a progression that was wrong in every way that mattered. Not the organized response of soldiers to a defined threat. Something more chaotic than that, more primal. The specific sound of wolves losing the thread of their own discipline, not under external attack but under something internal, something happening inside the boundary of the pack itself, spreading with the particular efficiency of a thing that doesn't need to be chosen because it bypasses the choosing apparatus entirely. Saurin was at the window before I had finished processing the sound. "The outer garrison," he said. Below, in the torchlit yard, the wolves assigned to the eastern wall had stopped moving in patterns that made tactical sense. They were moving the way animals move when something has been introduced into the environment, that their instincts cannot correctly parse, jerking, reactive, intermittently aggressive toward each other rather than outward. One of them had shifted, which under normal garrison protocol required direct alpha command. He had shifted without it, and the shift was wrong. Too fast, too incomplete. The kind of shift that happens when the control layer between wolf and human has been chemically or magically circumvented. Dark magic. I knew the signature of it, the way an Omega who had grown up in the margins of pack society knows the signatures of the things the powerful use to control the powerless. Because dark magic and its practitioners have historically found the bottom of the hierarchy, the most convenient testing ground, for methods that cannot be presented to the top until they are already proven. Someone had dosed the Eastern Garrison's water supply, and the infection was spreading inward. "It was never about the council," I said, and heard my own voice come out with a quiet I did not entirely feel, but that some part of me had decided was more useful than the alternative. Kaylin's political maneuvering, the compact motion, the signatures, the formal censure, it was misdirection. Something to keep you focused on the chamber while the real move was positioned. Saurin turned from the window. "Where is Augustine?" I asked. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He crossed to the door. The stronghold in the grip of a dark magic dispersal is not a battlefield in any conventional sense. It doesn't have lines or formations or the organized grammar of warfare that soldiers train for. It has hallways that are safe, and then aren't, corners that have nothing behind them and then do, the sound of fighting in rooms you can't see that tells you the spread has moved further inward than the last time you checked. It has the specific horror of familiar faces wearing expressions they don't normally wear, eyes that have gone slightly wrong, that are tracking things that aren't there or failing to track things that are. We move together through it. That is the thing I want to hold precisely, because it mattered in a way that transcended tactics. We moved together, not Saurin ahead with me managed behind him, not me following the strategic lead of the Alpha King through his own stronghold. Together, shoulder to shoulder through the corridors, adjusting to each other's movement with the instinctive synchronization that the mate bond had been quietly building between us since the execution circle, each of us reading the other's intention a half-second before it became action, and positioning accordingly. 3 wolves came at us in the great corridor. Not enemies, pack. Garrison wolves who had been on roster 2 days ago and who were now something in between their human and wolf selves, caught at an involuntary threshold, operating on a fear-aggression loop that the dark magic had stripped of its governor. Saurin stepped into the first one with the controlled force of a dominant alpha, no hesitation, no cruelty, just the absolute assertion of hierarchical gravity, the kind that in an uncompromised wolf would have triggered immediate submission. The dark magic had compromised the submission response. The wolf did not yield. Saurin took a blow across the left shoulder that he absorbed and did not show, and I felt that was the thing I was not prepared for, the full reality of what sharing a mate bond means when both people are inside a live conflict. I felt the impact move through him as a specific, physical transmission through the bond. Not pain exactly, but the echo of it, the body's record of force received, and the involuntary, protective rage that flooded me in response was not something I had experienced before. It moved through me like a chemical, like something unlocking. The second wolf turned toward me, and something happened that I did not plan, did not consciously initiate, could not have predicted from any prior experience of myself, because I had 26 years of experience as an Omega, 26 years of understanding my body as the bottom of a hierarchy, as something calibrated to yield and absorb and survive quietly rather than to project or command or take up space in the register that alpha wolves occupy. The shift came from somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the registry and the assigned rank and the carefully maintained smallness, beneath even the knowledge of the bloodline document and the founding lineage and every external confirmation of what I actually was. It came from the place where the truth of a thing lives before anyone has told it to you, where it has always been living, patient and intact, waiting for the moment the door gets knocked down from the inside. I shifted. Silver. Not the gray-brown of Omega wolves, not the dark tones of dominant pack wolves. Silver, the particular, unmistakable silver that appears in founding bloodline wolves and nowhere else, that has not been seen in the Northern Territories in 26 years, that every wolf above a certain age knows by reputation, and every wolf below a certain age knows by the expression it produces on the faces of those above them when the stories come up. The corridor went briefly, completely still. Even the feral wolves stopped, because silver does something to the air, not metaphorically, physically. An alpha command from a founding bloodline wolf changes the atmospheric pressure of a space in a way that every wolf present feels before they understand it, before their conscious mind has processed what they're seeing or what it means. It reaches directly into the part of their neurology that is older than language and older than hierarchy, and older than any compact or council or political machinery, the part that recognizes power, not because it has been told to, but because it was born knowing the difference between this approximation of dominance and the real thing. The command that came out of me was not a sentence. It was not a direction or an order or a formally constructed exercise of authority. It was a sound that meant stop in the oldest possible language, and every wolf in that corridor, feral or not, stopped. And then I heard Augustine's voice. He was in the throne room. We found him there because the trail of it led there, the spreading edge of the dark magic dispersal, the density of it increasing as we moved inward, the way the air thickened and changed the closer we got, like walking toward the center of a weather system and feeling the pressure build. He was standing at the far end of the room, and the man I had watched at the cell bars with his measuring, careful gaze was present, but altered not in the way the garrison wolves were altered, not frenzied or feral, or chemically stripped of his control. Augustine was entirely himself. That was the worst version. Not a man who had been compromised. A man who had made a choice, and made it deliberately, and was standing in the wreckage of it with the steady expression of someone who has accepted the cost. She shouldn't exist, he said. Not loudly. Not with the performance of a villain constructing a justification. With the flat, terrible sincerity of a man who genuinely believes what he is saying. The founding bloodlines consolidate power in ways this territory cannot survive. Mirail Ashvan would have challenged the compact. Her daughter will do the same. The work I did 26 years ago was, "You buried her," Saurin said. His voice was very quiet. "You changed the archive. You arranged the registry. I protected the stability of 6 packs. You killed Celine. The room absorbed that." Augustine's face did something complicated. Not shame. Not the flinching response of someone caught. Something more agonized than that. She found the original archive entry. She came to me. She was going to tell you. A breath. I could not allow that to become the investigation that followed her to an omega in the lower quarter. The frame required, he moved, faster than a man his age should move, which told me the dark magic wasn't only in the water supply, that he had been using it himself, that whatever ritual had produced the compound in the garrison had been tested privately first, and that Augustine had been its first subject and its most sophisticated product. The blade he produced was not iron. It was the same material as the silver rope, refined further, a weapon specifically constructed for the mate bond's most catastrophic vulnerability. If you strike through a mate bond with silver, you don't kill one wolf. You kill both. He went for Saurin. Not for me for Saurin, because Augustine was a strategist above everything else, and a strategist attacking a mated pair goes for the primary bond anchor, the wolf whose death will transmit through the connection with enough force to stop the other heart before it has time to understand what is happening. I was already moving, not because I had calculated it, because the bond had already transmitted the trajectory of the blade before my eyes had fully tracked it, and my body had already committed to the interception before my mind had issued the instruction, and the silver wolf is considerably faster than the omega the registry had always said I was. I hit Augustine from the side. The blade went wide, and I unleashed it again, not the silver shift this time, but the command, the full founding bloodline Alpha command, the thing I had felt building since the corridor outside the Great Hall, which had been growing with every step toward the center of the dark magic, as if the wrongness of it was burning off the last of the trained smallness, the last of the 26-year architecture of diminishment, and leaving behind only what had always been there underneath it. The sound that came out of me was not a sound I had ever made before. It filled the throne room from floor to ceiling and from wall to wall, and I felt it leave me not just from my throat but from somewhere structural, from the bloodline itself, from Mireille Ashvane and the generations of founding wolves behind her, from every ancestor who had carried this line through the centuries and deposited it, intact, in an omega registry in the lower quarter for 26 years of waiting. Augustine dropped. Not dead, I want to be clear about that, because I am not the kind of power that kills when it can stop. He dropped to his knees with the involuntary submission of a wolf whose nervous system has been overridden by something it cannot fight, and the dark magic compound moving through the garrison stuttered and then collapsed, because it had been keyed to his command, and his command was no longer functioning. The stronghold went quiet. Not the dungeon quiet of stone and dripping water, the large quiet of a space that has just contained something significant, and is now in the first moments of its aftermath, wolves throughout the corridor regaining themselves, guards sitting down on the floor they had been standing on, the confused and disoriented process of people reconnecting with their own agency. Saurin reached me, his hands on my face, checking not ceremonially, with urgent practicality, the way you check someone you have just watched take a blow in your place. Are you? I'm fine, I said. You intercepted a silver blade. I'm aware, Annabella. Saurin. I held his gaze. I'm fine. Check the garrison. He looked at me for 3 seconds with the expression of a man who wants very much to continue this conversation and has accepted that the moment doesn't allow for it. You shifted silver, he said. Just that. I know. The founding line is not extinct. No, I said. It never was. He exhaled. And for one moment, in the middle of the aftermath and the quiet and the cold of the throne room, with Augustine kneeling at the far end, and the blood moon still red through the high windows and every wolf in the stronghold beginning the slow process of returning to themselves, he pressed his forehead to mine. The bond moved between us, carrying what neither of us had the space to say out loud. I felt that. Every second of it. I felt the blade's trajectory in your body before I saw it. I felt your choice to intercept. I felt the command leave you like a shockwave. I know. Don't do that again. I'll do exactly that again. His arms around me. Tight, brief, the specific grip of someone who has just run the calculation of what the last 60 seconds could have produced, and is holding the outcome that didn't happen alongside the outcome that did. It's not over, I said against his shoulder. No. Kaelin knew. Not all of it, but enough. Augustine didn't operate this alone. I know. The Northern Territories are going to need a reckoning. Yes, he said. They are. He let me go. Straightened. Looked at me with those silver eyes in the blood moonlight, and I looked back at him, the silver wolf and the Alpha King, and the bond between us that had arrived uninvited and unreasonable, and had turned out to be the most consequential thing in both our lives. The throne room was waiting. The stronghold was waiting. The entire political architecture of the Northern Territories, built on a buried bloodline and a dead woman's secret, and 26 years of someone else's careful, patient lie, all of it was waiting for what came next. We turned toward it together. Augustine did not resist the binding. That was the part that stayed with me through everything that followed. Not the dark magic dispersal, not the blood moon still burning red through the throne room windows, not even the compound fracture of discovering that the man who had sat at the right hand of 3 kings had spent 26 years maintaining a lie carefully enough that not one of those kings had ever touched the edge of it. What stayed with me was the way he accepted the iron shackles with the specific, exhausted compliance of a man who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has, in the moment of its collapse, arrived at something that is not quite relief but is adjacent to it. He was finished holding it. 2 of Saurin's personal guard led him out. Saurin watched him go without speaking, and I stood beside him and did not try to fill the silence, because there are losses that require their moment of being exactly what they are before anything useful can be said about them. Augustine had been his counsel, his strategist, the person whose judgment he had trusted through every political crisis and pact negotiation and private moment of uncertainty across a decade of rulership. The betrayal was not simple. The grief of it was not simple. I had learned enough, in the weeks of this story, to understand that grief does not simplify on demand. I let it be what it was. After a long moment, Saurin turned. "I need to address the pack," he said. "I know. All 6 packs. The full assembly. Not just Ironvale, all of them. What happened tonight is not a local event." He looked at me steadily. "And what comes next is not either." Outside, the stronghold was rebuilding its order. The dark magic had dispersed with Augustine's command broken, and the garrison wolves were themselves again shaken, disoriented, with the particular quality of people who have temporarily lost the thread of their own agency and are now conducting the uneasy inventory of what they did in its absence. The healers were moving through the courtyards. The senior guards were reassembling their rosters. The living machinery of a large pack was doing what living machinery does after a disruption, finding its rhythm again, piece by piece, with the pragmatic resilience of people who understand that the alternative to continuing is not an option. Dawn was 2 hours away. It felt, in the specific way that only the hours before a decisive moment can feel, like the world holding its breath. They came from all 6 territories within 3 days. Saurin had sent riders before the blood moon had fully set, not formal summons, not the bureaucratic apparatus of a council convening, but personal messages, delivered by wolves who reported directly to the king and to no one else, carrying the specific language of a summons that is not optional. The Alpha representatives arrived in sequence, each one entering the stronghold with the cautious, assessing energy of wolves who have received news that does not yet fully resolve into a picture they recognize, and are managing their response to the unresolved edges. Kalen arrived last. He knew before he dismounted. I could see it in the way he moved, in the slight stiffness of a man whose political intelligence had already begun the work of assessing the new landscape, before he had officially accepted that the landscape had changed. Augustine's arrest had traveled faster than the riders. It always does, in a community as interconnected as the Northern Pack territories. Information moves on the wind and through the bond networks, and in the particular frequency of whisper that carries furthest precisely because it is trying not to be heard. He knew what had been uncovered. He knew his degree of separation from it was thinner than he had been counting on. He walked into the great hall and took his seat at the council table, with the dignified composure of a man who has decided that the only remaining asset worth protecting is the performance of having nothing to hide. Saurin did not allow the performance to run long. The bloodline document was presented in full. The archive records both the original and the altered version, recovered and compared by 3 independent archivists working simultaneously to prevent any further interference. The evidence of the surveillance conducted on me in the weeks before Celine's death. Renwick's testimony, obtained from the border territory where he had gone to ground, extracted via an extradition order that had gone out the same morning the riders did. The chemical analysis of the compound used in the garrison, traced back to a supplier whose records showed a single buyer over a period of 18 months. Piece by piece, the structure of it assembled itself on that table. The assembly of Alpha representatives sat with it. Kalen tried twice to reframe the narrative, not with direct denial, which would have been immediately unsustainable, but with the more sophisticated mechanism of context, of degrees of knowledge, of the distinction between being aware of a general plan and being aware of its specific methods. He was good at it. He had been good at it for 60 years, but he was doing it in a room where the founding bloodline evidence was sitting directly in front of him, and the founding bloodline it described was standing at the right hand of the Alpha King, with the mate mark at her throat, and the memory of a silver wolf command moving through the nervous system of every wolf in the building who had been present in those corridors 3 nights ago. The room was not persuadable in the direction he needed it to go. He went quiet on the 3rd attempt, and in the quiet, Saurin spoke the verdict. Not execution. That is a thing I want to be clear about, because I am aware of the satisfying narrative logic that would place Kaelin in the execution circle, the way I had been placed in it, and I understand the appeal of that symmetry, and I rejected it as firmly as I had rejected every version of myself that had been handed to me by people who needed me to be a particular kind of small. Vengeance is not justice. It is justice's impatient, less careful sibling, and the Northern Territories had been governed by its impatience long enough. Exile. Permanent. The stripping of rank and the dissolution of the compact provisions that had given the High Council its extrajudicial authority over execution proceedings. Provisions that had been used once to condemn me, and that would not remain, available to be used again. The Council, as a body of unchecked political authority, was finished. What replaced it was a structure I had spent the intervening 3 days quietly drafting in Saurin's private wing, because it turned out that 26 years of surviving at the bottom of a hierarchy gives you a remarkably placed forwarded, specific and practical education in every way that the hierarchy fails the people it is supposed to serve, and that education had been sitting in me, unused, waiting for the moment it had a room large enough to be useful in. A representative body, elected from pack membership rather than appointed by proximity to power, with defined jurisdictional limits, with a formal mechanism for the presentation and investigation of evidence before any verdict of consequence could be ratified. The founding bloodline compact, rewritten. The Alpha representatives received it with varying degrees of enthusiasm, skepticism, and the particular guarded interest of people who are assessing whether a change in the rules benefits or disadvantages them specifically. That is the nature of governance. It is never clean, never universally welcome, never received with the unambiguous relief that the people who drafted it in the small hours of the morning on the adrenaline of surviving something almost catastrophic would find ideal. But it was received, and it was ratified, and Kaelin was escorted from the hall before the ink had dried. The crowning was not what I expected. I had constructed an image of it, somewhere in the days between Augustine's defeat and the Assembly's ratification, that was appropriately formal, the ceremonial weight of it, the public architecture of a thing that was being done before witnesses and for the record. I had prepared myself for the performance of it. What Saurin did was not a performance. He had dismissed the formal heralds, had kept the assembly but released the ceremonial protocol, the arranged postures and scripted declarations and the layers of ritual that existed, as most ritual exists, primarily to remind everyone present of the distance between the person at the center of the ceremony and the people watching it. He had stripped it down to its essential truth, which was not a ritual at all but a recognition. He came down from the dais. He came to me. He was carrying the crown, not Iron Vale's hereditary crown, which was Saurin's by descent and would remain so, but the Ashvane crown, recovered from the deep archive, where it had been catalogued as belonging to an extinct line, and stored with the particular careful neglect reserved for things that are preserved, because destroying them would require acknowledging they one Grek exist. It was old, simple in the way that things are simple when their age has burned away every decorative element that wasn't load-bearing. Silver, inevitably. The same silver as my wolf, which I chose not to read as coincidence. He stood in front of me, and the room the assembled Alpha representatives, the senior wolves of 6 territories, the guards and the archivists and the healers and the garrison wolves who had come in from the courtyard and were filling the back of the hall in a silent overflow crowd that no one had officially invited, and no one had asked to leave. The room went the particular quality of quiet that only happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand that they are witnessing something they will describe to people who weren't present for the rest of their lives. He raised the crown, and before he placed it, he looked at me, just me, as if the room had contracted to this single exchange, and said, quietly enough that it was technically private, and publicly enough that anyone paying close attention could hear it, "You were always meant to rule." I held his gaze. "I was raised as an Omega," I said. Not as a protest, not as resistance, as the truth of what had been done to me, stated plainly, in the room where the people responsible for it had just been held accountable. As the record, set straight, in front of witnesses. His expression was very steady and very warm and entirely certain. "Then they buried a queen," he said, "and the queen came back anyway." He placed the crown on my head. The silver was cool against my skin for exactly 1 second, and then it warmed the way metal warms against the body, the way belonging feels when you stop fighting it, the way truth settles when it finally occupies the space it was always meant to occupy. The room moved, not in the organized way of a scripted ceremony, in the spontaneous, entirely unmanaged way of wolves responding to something their instincts recognize before their minds have assembled the appropriate social response. A sound that built from the back of the hall forward, from the garrison wolves and the overflow crowd, and the people who had been at the bottom of every room they had ever stood in, and who understood, without being told, what it meant that the person wearing a founding bloodline crown tonight had started this story bound in silver rope in an execution circle. The roar of it filled the hall. The wedding hunt is the oldest tradition in the Northern Pack territories. Not a ceremony, not a formality. The oldest form of commitment available to mated wolves, older than councils and compacts and bloodline registries, and every layer of institutional architecture that civilization had built over the top of what wolves fundamentally are, before the documentation, before the politics, before all of it. 2 wolves, the dark, the forest, running. It is not a race. It is not a chase, in the hierarchical sense that word implies. It is the choosing, the active, physical, embodied choosing, made with the whole body rather than with a signature on a document, of the person you intend to run beside for the rest of your life. It is done at night, under open sky, in the form that is most honest about what you are. We left the stronghold at the hour when the blood moon was finally descending. The tree line waited, the same tree line I had looked at from the execution circle, the same trees I had seen from his window, that had been the backdrop of every significant moment in this story from its beginning. They looked like they had been waiting. I don't know if that is true, or if it is only the way memory arranges landscape retrospectively, making the world appear to have been in on things it had no particular awareness of. But they looked like they had been waiting. We shifted at the edge of the trees. His wolf was exactly what I should have known he would be: massive, dark, silver-tipped at the shoulders and the jaw, moving with the controlled precision of an animal whose power is so established it doesn't need to advertise itself. He turned to look at me in the wolf form, and his eyes were the same silver they were in every form, and what was in them was everything that had passed between us since the execution circle, all of it, distilled into the simple, wordless animal fact of being beside each other in the dark. My wolf was silver from throat to tail, complete, present. Not the careful, battered, deliberately small thing I had maintained for 26 years of survival. Not diminished, not hidden. The real thing. He touched his nose to my jaw, the wolf equivalent of the gesture that has no adequate human language, the one that means you and here and finally all at once, and then he turned toward the deep forest. And I ran. Not after him, beside him, shoulder to shoulder into the dark between the trees, through the cold and the smell of pine and wet earth, and the particular aliveness of a winter forest at the hour before dawn, when the world is still deciding what kind of day it wants to be. The bond between us was not a wait anymore. It was a current bidirectional, mutual, the specific warmth of 2 wolves who have stopped fighting the fact of each other and have allowed the allowing to become something simple and large and entirely theirs. I had come into this story bound in silver and waiting to die. I came out of it running in silver through the dark, with the crown packed safely in the archive and the mate mark at my throat, and the Alpha King of the Northern Territories beside me, not ahead, not behind, not managing my trajectory or containing my pace, or deciding, from a position of authority, what kind of animal I was permitted to be. Beside me, equal to equal, step for step, the trees opened ahead of us into a clearing, and the last of the blood moon sat at the horizon, and the sky above was doing its first tentative experiments with the colors that come before dawn, that deep, uncertain blue that is not quite night and not quite morning, that exists in the space between the story ending and whatever comes next. We did not slow down. We ran through the clearing and back into the trees and further, deeper, into the cold and the dark, and the living silence of a forest that had been here before any of this, and would be here long after, and none of it was the ending. Endings are for stories that have been resolved into stillness. What we were running into was not stillness. It was everything that came after the being buried. After the execution circle, and the dungeon, and the blade, and the bond, and the crown, and the blood moon, and the 26 years of someone else's lie. After the surviving, this was the living. This was the beginning of the living. And the forest received us into its dark and its cold and its ancient, patient quiet. And we ran. We found the cliff the way you find the things that matter most without looking for them. The forest had carried us east without agenda, the bond between us navigating rather than either of us deciding, and when the trees thinned and the ground rose, and we broke through the tree line onto the wide limestone shelf that overlooked the valley, we both slowed at the same moment. Not because we had planned to stop here, because the place asked for stopping, with the particular authority of landscape that has been receiving the weight of significant moments for long enough that it knows how to hold them. We shifted back at the edge. Below us, the Iron Vale Valley was waking up, the stronghold first lights appearing in the garrison towers, smoke rising from the kitchens, the distant sound of the morning bell beginning its count. Then the settlement beyond the walls, the pack structures and the market roads and the lower quarter where I had lived for 4 years in a rented room, and moved through my days as carefully as someone who understands that visibility is a liability. The whole geography of a life I had inhabited from the bottom up, spread out below me in the early light. The sun was coming. Not fully, not yet, but the sky had committed to it. That specific moment when dawn stops being a possibility and becomes an announcement, the horizon going from deep blue to something warm and incremental, and entirely sure of itself. Saurin stood beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. That was something I had learned about him. Across the dungeon conversations and the council chambers and the blood moon night and everything between that, he understood the value of not filling a moment with language it didn't need. That silence for him was not absence, but a different kind of presence. He had learned, I think, that grief teaches you this, that when you have sat long enough in the kind of quiet that loss creates, you stop being afraid of what silence contains. I looked out over the valley, and I thought about 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago I was kneeling in the dirt of the execution circle with silver burning my wrists, and 1,000 wolves breathing around me, and the specific, settled certainty of a woman who has run out of options and is making her peace with the shape of that. I was waiting to die. Not passively, I had not stopped being myself, had not handed over that last private resistance, but I had accepted the mathematics of the situation, and the mathematics said the blade was going to complete its descent, and that would be the end of everything I was and everything I might have been, and everything that had been buried in a registry office 26 years ago that I didn't yet know about. Today, I was standing on a cliff at dawn with a crown in the archive and a mate mark at my throat, and the founding bloodline's truth restored to the record where it belonged. I let that sit inside me for a moment. Not triumphantly, not with the performed satisfaction of a victory that has been narrated toward its conclusion. Just quietly. The way you hold a thing when it is real, and you want to make sure you are actually receiving it rather than watching yourself receive it from a careful distance. Saurin's hand found mine. No ceremony. Just the simple physical fact of it. His hand, warm, certain, present. The same hand that had shot out in an execution circle and stopped a blade 1 inch from my throat on the instinct of a bond that had arrived without asking either of us first. I looked at him. He was looking out over the valley, the early light doing something quiet to his profile. The grief still there, would always be somewhere there, but held differently now, carried rather than wearing him. The difference between a man under a weight and a man who has learned the weight's true measure and adjusted his stance accordingly. 3 weeks ago, I said. He turned to look at me. I was kneeling in the dirt. I said it simply, not for sympathy, for the record, for the specific pleasure of saying a true thing out loud in the open air on a cliff at dawn, after weeks of saying true things in dungeons and council chambers and the urgent, pressured dark of crisis, waiting to die, certain it was over. He was very still, looking at me. Today I'm standing beside the man who stopped the blade. I turned back to the valley, to the stronghold and the settlement and the lower quarter and the full, breathing, complicated, living landscape of everything that came next. Funny thing about fate, the sun broke the horizon. Just the edge of it, the first real light, orange and immediate and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 3 weeks, because the sun does not keep score of human urgency and wolf politics and the long, intricate machinations of people who try to bury the things they fear. It just rises. It only needed 1 inch, I said. Saurin lifted our joined hands and pressed his lips to my knuckles, the same quiet, witnessing gesture he had given my wrists in the dungeon, the one that had no performance in it, no claim, only the acknowledgement of what a thing had cost, and the decision to honor that cost rather than look past it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The valley woke up below us, and the sun climbed, and the bond between us ran warm and steady, and entirely without apology, in the space between 2 wolves standing at the edge of a cliff at dawn. The queen they tried to execute, and the king who stopped the blade, and the 1 inch of the grace between the story that almost happened and the one that did, the one that was still happening, the one that had, against every odd and every design of every person who had invested in our smallness, only just begun. The end. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.